last week I reached that point I start to feel towards the end of every winter where I just can't stand the cold anymore. I'm done with it. I'm ready to curl up and sleep out the rest of the winter. Wake me up when it's summer again. But I can't do that, so instead the mood channeled itself into a burst of motivation to make a stripy summer dress that's been on my list for so long, and I promptly messed it up and wasted half of my fabric, so we'll have to get back to that one later. Instead, I decided to make something less exciting, but much more immediately useful. One last heavy wool skirt to cap off my winter wardrobe updates. This skirt I based off a design I've seen floating around Pinterest. It's available at a vintage fashion reproduction website, which I'll link below. But it's pretty simple. A flared skirt with a fitted waist, a seam up the center front, a patched pocket on one side, and a button closure on the other side. This type of button closure in particular I love, and I've been wanting to do for a while. The fabric is a recent purchase from Mood. It's a double cloth, which turned out to mean it's actually 2 layers of wool held together with tiny pad stitches. This is definitely meant for coats because, dear lord, is it thick. And I know I've said that about basically every wool I've used this winter, but this stuff does take the cake. Hella thick. Quite the body. So that'll be interesting to work with. I don't love how thick it is, but I do love the texture and the hand. It is so soft, some of the softest wool I've ever felt. The color is perfect. It's like an oatmeal striped with cocoa, a great shade of light brown that will be super versatile with the rest of my wardrobe. So for the pattern, I'm going to use my 3/4 circle skirt with a fitted waist. I drafted it a couple videos back if you missed that one, but really any flared skirt pattern would work as long as the flare is fitted to your waist. I didn't even bother to make new patterns for this project, I just added on to this one and I cut the other pieces from measurements. For the skirt pattern, it already includes seam allowance at the top edge and hem allowance at the bottom edge, but both sides are on a fold. So for the skirt back, I'll leave one side as a fold line and I'll add a 1/2 inch of seam allowance to the other side. For the skirt front, since the center front has a seam, I'll add seam allowance to both sides. Now, the pattern isn't done. I also need to add a bit to the top of the sides for the button closure. For the front, I'll just fold a bit under and use that double thickness to structure the buttonholes. For the back piece, I need that placket to fit underneath the front side, so that when the two sides are stitched together, the plackets perfectly overlap each other. I want the button placket to be 1.5 inches wide, so I'll add 1.5 inches past the seam allowance, and then another 1/2 inch for seam allowance for the placket. I'll make the placket 9 inches long, so that I can space my buttons 2 inches apart. On the back, since the placket needs to extend past the seam, I'll add 1.5 inches, and then another 1.5, making the center a fold line, then another 1/2 inch for the seam allowance. I did have to cut the skirt about 2 inches shorter than my 29-inch pattern length. That is because my fabric wasn't quite wide enough to fit the 3/4 circle skirt, and because it had a nap, I didn't want to rotate the pattern or cut it on a different grain line. The biggest challenge for me with this project was figuring out the best way to work with this super thick double cloth. However, the reason I decided to make the project was because I thought it would be really interesting to play around with the fact that it's like a pre-pad stitched fabric, and that I could split apart different portions to help with the finishings. So that's what I decided to do with the front seam. I pulled the 2 layers apart by about 1 inch, then I placed the skirt fronts together and folded the outer layers back, pinning them out of the way. I stitched just those inner layers together. Then when I laid it out on the ironing board and opened it up, I had a bit of a weird flashback to dissections in high school biology. I ironed the seam open and then I folded those extra layers back over the top, folding the raw edges in and lining them up with the seam. I pinned them, then hand-stitched those layers closed, whipping around the folds. In the end, this is what the seam looked like. It's pretty much invisible and identical front and back. Interesting. I decided to make the button closure on the right side of the skirt because I'm left-handed, so I use my left side pockets much more frequently. That means the left side of the front and back pieces can have the extra flaps for the placket trimmed off. Then I stitched up and finished that side seam just like I did the center front. After I finished, I decided I really didn't love the way this seam looked. It was just a lot more visible than I expected. I hadn't counted on how much the separated layers would stretch, and how much more loose and flexible they would sit, and how visibly that would stand out against the body of the unaltered double cloth. When I looked closer at the fabric, I think I figured out the reason. One side of the oatmeal stripes run diagonally across the fabric, and on the other side the diagonal direction is reversed. Both layers have a decent amount of diagonal stretch, but because they're lined up in reverse, the stretch is cancelled out. So when I separated them, I let them stretch again, which is why they sort of ripple and bubble around the seam. So in my game of seeing if I've had a brilliant idea or just a dumb one, I think this one was meh at best. With the last seam, I decided to try something different. This time I sewed the seam in the usual way, unaltered, though I had to remember to back tack at the placket opening instead of sewing the whole seam. I decided to tackle the finishings one side at a time, starting with the front. At the top, I made a little clip at the base of the placket. Now that the seam was stitched, I split the two layers of fabric and I trimmed the underside down by half. A little bit, maybe a little bit more. Then I pulled the layers apart around the base and side of the placket and trimmed it too. Around the placket, I folded in that untrimmed edge, then I folded the placket at the center side. To finish the side seam, I folded the top layer around the shortened one, covering up both raw edges. I felled around the placket and down the seam. And now we have one nice clean edge and an invisible placket to reinforce the buttonholes. For the back side, I finished the seam in the exact same way. I also trimmed down one layer of the placket, but I folded it to line up with the center side, leaving an 1.5 inch extension. Then, when I was felling those seams, I lined up the base of that extended placket up over the base of the underlaying placket, and then I stitched them securely together. And here's what the finished placket looks like. I do love plackets like this. They are pretty easy to calculate and sew, but I would usually have finished them differently, and a lot more simply. The double cloth definitely complicates things. For the waistband, I want it to be 1 3/4 inch wide. Usually I go for more like 1 1/4 or 1.5, but I wanted this waistband to be a bit wider than usual to make it more proportional with the oversized buttons. So take 1 3/4 and then double it for 3.5. Then add seam allowance to both sides, giving us 4.5. For the length, I want the finished waist to be 28.5. I need to add 1.5 to underlap the button, and then I need to add another inch for seam allowance. So I'll cut a waistband that is 4.5 by 31 inches. Then I pinned the waistband to the skirt, and man, this is probably the #1 reason why I loved flared skirts like this. I mean, they look plenty flattering on, but it's just such a relief not to have to pleat and gather things every once in a while. I sewed the waistband to the skirt, then on the skirt seam allowance, I split the two layers, then trimmed down the inside layer. I also split and trimmed the waistband allowance, and then I pulled apart the layers on the other 3 waistband sides and trimmed it down by about 1/2 inch. I used that edge as a fold line for ironing down the allowance, and then I turned the waistband in and covered up all of the raw edges, hand stitching along the waist and the 2 ends. I tried a few different options for the hem. I didn't want to waste any allowance since I'd already had to sacrifice 2 inches of length to fit my pattern across the fabric. I thought maybe I could use some lace as a facing, but I realized that was probably just going to make it even bulkier than it already was. That was the other issue. I didn't want to double fold it like I usually would for a hem because it was so thick already. In the end, I decided that the fabric is sturdy enough, and it's not like I'll ever be washing it, and it's not like I'm going to win any awards for construction on this one anyways, so I just folded it up once and felled it down. And yes, if you notice the chicken, this is Amidala. She's ordinarily not this chill, but she was having a bad day. There was a hawk that morning. It happens every once in a while, but the rooster always fights them off, and we don't have huge hawks in town. But they were all freaked out, and when I went out to check on them, I saw Amidala laying down along the fence. I went to her and picked her up, and she was all frozen. I thought maybe she was injured, but no, I think she was just scared. So she let me carry her around for a while, which she usually doesn't do. Then whenever I went out there for the rest of the day, she was acting off. She was following me around and not even bothering to bully the younger birds. So I brought her inside while I was hemming, and she just chilled out and napped on my lap. She was back to normal the next day, so all's well. I want the pocket to fit my phone. That's really the main requirement. So I laid out my phone and measured 2 inches on all 4 sides. Then I did need to add a bit more to the top for the hem, so I measured another inch out. I could just fold these edges down to the inside, but I had one more idea to try. I peeled away and trimmed down a 1/2 inch from all 4 sides. Then, instead of using that inner ridge as the fold line, I instead folded the edge to meet it. And when I ironed it, it laid perfectly smooth because both sides had exactly 2 layers. Then I ironed it in by another fold and felled it down. This was honestly the best looking, best feeling, least bulky finishing I tried. I would probably have used a method like this for the whole skirt if I was going to do it again, but I'm not going to do it again. Then I turned in the bottom edge, then the top, though I folded down the top by 1 inch. I felled these, and the pocket is perfectly finished and ready to be sewn onto the skirt. I placed it over the left side seam, and the stitch I used to set it was probably not the best. It's basically just small whip stitches. I'm sure there was a nicer looking, stronger stitch I could have used, but I didn't think of one. But yeah, with the pocket attached, all that's left is the main event, the primary attraction, the buttons. I have a few new tools to show you today. This one came from Amazon. You can use it to evenly space buttons or eyelets or pleats or anything you want without having to measure anything. I haven't used it that much yet, but mainly because I keep forgetting I have it and then just doing the math anyways. The only real downside of it is that it only goes up to 8 markers, but it's still handy. I used it to measure out placements for my 4 buttons. It ended up being about 2 inches, which is what I had planned for when cutting the placket. I sewed the buttons on, and then I used the buttons to mark placements for the button holes on the front side. I made 3 vertical buttonholes down the placket, centered over each button. Then I did a horizontal hole at the waistband. Remember to set this hole back a bit so that the end of it hits the button center. Otherwise, your waistband won't end up fitting how you planned. It'll be too loose and gaping. That's a mistake I made with these trousers. Don't do that. I sewed the buttonholes by machine, and yeah, don't at me. There are things I find pleasant and relaxing to hand sew, and for some reason buttonholes are just not on that list. And then, to open the buttonholes, I used this little clover tool, another recent purchase. It's nice and sharp and it works great, but I did have problems with the stitch thread getting nicked every once in a while. This happens when I use a seam ripper to open buttonholes too, so I don't know, maybe it's just a me problem. But to help with that, I've started tracing over my buttonholes with fray check. I use fray check on the backside of the fabric, and you should be careful because sometimes it bleeds through, and on some fabrics it will leave a mark. I also fray checked the little clump of stitches at the back of the buttons, doubly securing them. This might be a good trick to keep in mind if you're prone to losing buttons. You could even do it with store-bought clothes, like the type of clothes that you sometimes get that the buttons are real loose and you can totally see yourself losing one, and you think, I probably ought to just re-sew these all right now before I even wear it, but you also know that you're too lazy to do that until you actually lose a button. So, fray check, not sponsored. There are things about this skirt that I love and things that I don't love. I really love the 3/4 circle skirt. This might be like my new go-to skirt pattern. I love the level of fullness it has. However, it does hang a bit weird, especially at the 2 sides where the pocket and the button placket throw it off a bit. This double cloth was insanely thick. It was fun to play around with, but I think I'm done for a while. Maybe it's just the impending spring weather talking, but I am really ready to put away the heavy winter wools and dig out my linens and my cotton stash again. So the skirt is fine. It's exactly what I wanted. A versatile, comfortable daily wear skirt that I can throw on and be warm next winter, whether I'm working from home or out running errands. But I feel like the overall effect would have just been a little bit better if I'd used a more medium weight wool. However, I will recognize that my minor qualms with this project are probably mostly just due to me being really done with the cold and winter in general, and yeah. I'm sure by the time I dig it out next fall, I will completely have forgotten about all of my little critiques and nitpicks, and I'll just be happy to have it. Anyways, thanks for watching. There will not be a pattern for this skirt on the Patreon because it was basically a plug in your measurements type of project, easy to DIY without wasting a bunch of computer paper to print the pattern. But the next project, my blue striped dress, was another complicated one, so it will be another patterning adventure. I hope you liked this video. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can subscribe to me here on YouTube and follow my Instagram. And I have a separate YouTube channel if you enjoy writing and world building. See ya!